All right, so Senator Joe Manchin, the millionaire coal baron from West Virginia, has been out aggressively lobbying for his new Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 bill. And even though he has been functionally acting like a Republican throughout the entirety of the Biden administration so far, even with recent interviews that he's been doing where he straight up refuses to say whether or not he even wants Democrats to win in the November midterms, even with all of that context, still Fox News ghouls are turning against him and basically trying to portray him as some sort of a radical socialist or a Bernie Sanders type of Democrat. So I'm going to show you a couple of different clips here from this Fox News interview that he did recently, and I'll explain how completely wrong both of these people somehow are. So let's go ahead and jump into this.
So, I'm looking at the Penn-Wharton budget model, which you, Senator, have been known to watch. It examined the details of the Schumer-Manchin deal, and actually it said something very different than you just said. It said that the impact on inflation, this is a quote, the impact on inflation is statistically indistinguishable from zero through 2031. Penn-Wharton modelers are saying, we don't agree with those who think deficit reduction will lead in a straight line to lower inflation. But that's what the Democrats claim for their bill. So so both things can't be true. And this is something that they're studying. So are you wrong, or are you not giving all of the hard truth to Americans about what this is going to cost them in terms of inflation?
Let's say maybe they're wrong. Okay, there's other ones that said absolutely different than that. Moody's has said different. And you have the bipartisan budget policies. They've said, Maya McGinnis and her group came out. We had 17 Nobel laureates last year when I said inflation is real, it's going to be here, and it's going to hurt us immensely. They says, oh, no, it's going to be transitory. And 17 of the brightest in the country were
So
wrong.
let me ask you specifically what cuts inflation in this bill?
Let me ask you this. How in the world could it be inflation when you're cutting? My Republican friends always said, we got to start paying down debt. I've been a budget hawk my whole life. We're paying down $300 billion. You're saying massive expenses? 3.5 trillion in BBB was massive expenses.
You asked me a direct question, so I'm going to answer you. So how is it not a...
Okay, so I'm going to pause it here and then we're going to jump back into this clip because I just got to correct the record on what Joe Manchin just said there. First of all, the question and the framing that she was using in this question was complete nonsense, okay? Number one, there are many different ways that you can go about addressing inflation. It really just depends on the context and what are the primary drivers of inflation. It could be a demand side issue if you do inject too much money into the economy in the hands of average people. That could have some impact, but in terms of the inflationary pressures that we are actually dealing with here in the United States, it has very little to do with too much demand pressure from like overheating the economy and giving too many working class people stimulus checks or whatever the fuck. The main problems with inflation, the main drivers of inflation here have been two things. Number one, supply chain breakdowns due to the fact that we have spent decades in this country hollowing out our manufacturing base to serve the interests of multinational corporations who chose to export those manufacturing jobs overseas in order to exploit cheap labor. That's number one, supply chain breakdowns. And number two is just straight up corporate price gouging. We see this especially with like the oil and gas industry, where companies like Chevron and Exxon are literally right now reporting record profits, like all-time record profits, as we are seeing high gas prices for average Americans. So this is like a one-to-one correlation here. If you actually wanted to go about addressing inflation in a meaningful way right now in this country, you would target the corporations who are price gouging Americans, and you would build up a domestic manufacturing base in order to make sure that we have some of that resiliency built in to the country here domestically. So those are the things you would actually do to address inflation in a meaningful way. But the entire question of, and the answer really from Joe Manchin here, both of them are only talking about inflation as if it can be addressed by pushing austerity on working class people and reducing the money that is in circulation for working class people, while completely avoiding going after the corporations where not only are they price gouging people, but also that's where the disproportionate amount of wealth is sitting within this country. So those are a number of different things that you could do to address inflation. You could also raise taxes on the wealthy, but none of her question and the framing that she was using there took any of that into consideration whatsoever. Now, to push back a little bit more on what Joe Manchin was saying there, his claim was that the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better plan was going to somehow dramatically escalate inflation. 100% untrue, and even if you want to take this conservative deficit hawk approach to analyzing criticizing these types of bills? Well, here from the Center for American Progress and the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, they say that the cost estimates confirm that Build Back Better is fully paid for, says CAP's Seth Hanlon. So again, not only was Build Back Better not going to increase inflation, but it was also deficit neutral, and on top of that, it would have reduced inflation because you would have been saving the amount that people are having to put into things like healthcare costs, things like education costs, childcare costs, etc., with everything else that was included with that bill. So Build Back Better would have been helping average people deal with inflation even more so than his so-called Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So that part from Joe Manchin was 100% bullshit, but let's go ahead and jump back into this clip here.
Straight line. Because I'm not saying, and even Penn Wharton isn't saying that it won't eventually get there in a jagged line. But you know how it doesn't? Because we are cooking a higher rate of inflation right now ahead of wages. And even if everybody were to go out and get a job or 2 or 3 jobs right now, their wages can't keep up with what the cost of milk, bread, gas, so on and so forth.
Don't you think we ought to get those costs down? How you do that? By producing. You've got to produce your way out of this.
He's right about that part, okay? He is 100% right about having to invest to make productive capabilities here in the United States enhanced so that we can deal with some of the shortages. He is right on that front.
You can't sit back and wait your way out of it.
So you're going to open pipelines?
Absolutely. We're going to build pipelines. We're going to do more drilling.
How are you going to sell that to the President of the United States, who on day one
it's already been sold and bought? It's already been.
Absolutely love her framing there that Joe Biden is somehow like vehemently against the fossil fuel industry, or that he's fighting against their interests. Completely fucking ridiculous. But you're also dealing with a Senator Joe Manchin here who literally has personal financial stakes within the fossil fuel industry. So like the idea that this reporter, this so-called journalist, would ask him a question as if this is going to harm the fossil fuel industry. It's like, do you even know who the fuck you're talking to right now?
And it's part of the deal. It's part of the bill. All you have to do is read the bill, Harris, and you'll see. You're not going to be able to do any more offshore wind or offshore or onshore solar and wind unless we're absolutely doing more production with drilling and extraction. It's all part of a balanced approach. We need more energy.
Right, and that's a bad thing. I mean, he says that like it's a good thing, right? He's saying, well, there are some investments in green technology and energy and renewables and all of that, but it's going to be offset with more investments in fossil fuels, more pipelines, more production, etc. So really, that gets to the heart of like why I think this bill is dog shit, because yes, it does have some things that take us a couple of steps forward in the right direction, but if you're making sure that you're not making investments in renewables unless they're matched by investments in fossil fuels, then you're completely undercutting the progress that you would actually be making in meaningfully addressing climate change in a real way. So that in and of itself is a fucking problem, not something that you should be bragging about. But here goes Joe Manchin.
Today, and we also need to invest in the energy for the future. This is a balanced approach that everyone's been talking about, but everyone's upset for whatever reason because they're afraid it's a political bill. This is not a Democrat bill. This is not a Republican bill.
All right.
This is not a green deal. This is a red, white, and blue deal, Harris. And everyone's having a hard time understanding that we can walk and chew gum and do the great thing together if we'll still start looking at our country first and quit worrying about our politics.
What they see is a senator who they thought was moderate, who might push back on some of the talk about forcing us into
Harris.
A green situation.
I have pushed back on everything.
Let's talk taxes.
Joe Manchin pushing us into a green situation, according to this reporter here.
Think I'm going to roll over. I've been at this for 40 years. I have never, ever been pushed into doing something I didn't think was right for my state or my country.
Let's talk taxes. Another criticism is that this will raise taxes. The White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, said this when asked about Biden's position. Let's watch.
He promised it wasn't going to raise taxes on anybody making less than $400,000 a year, but the Joint Committee on Taxation says that is not true.
Well, that is incorrect.
So the Joint Committee on Taxation, which you guys heralded as an effective body when you were selling the infrastructure package, is not to be trusted here.
I said it is not correct because I will give you why it's not correct, because it is incomplete.
We got to know the bottom line on taxes.
Let me tell you the bottom line on that, Harris. You want to know the bottom line? The Joint Committee on Taxation? That opinion was only written by my friends on the Republican side. It was not done by the whole Joint Committee. So that is unfair, too. So let's be accurate what we're doing here. The bottom line is, how in the world can you be raising taxes when all we're saying is the wealthiest corporations in America 55 of them pay zero to help this great country of ours, to defend
Well,
ourselves.
how does this change that? Because that's
minimum,
part of
it's a
the
minimum
corporate
15%.
structuring,
It's
right?
a minimum of 15%. The tax rate was at 35% before 2017.
Right.
Then it went to 21%. That was a tremendous savings, but that's not good enough, I guess. All we're saying is at 15%
Look.
minimum, everyone in West Virginia I know, and most people around the country, pay a 21% corporate or greater. So why can't the greatest $1 billion of revenue a year, why can't they pay at least 15% for this great country?
Are you trying to also say, because this is the part that counts. I mean, people look at
She just completely avoided that part, right? That was like one of the only good points I've ever seen Joe Manchin make, right? Part of this bill is that it's going to be increasing taxes on wealthy corporations, really, like he was just describing there. The original corporate tax rate before the 2017 Trump tax cuts were sitting at 35%. Then they got cut down to 21%. And a lot of them, as he was just saying, there are over 50 of them that are sitting on the Fortune 500 list. They don't even pay a single goddamn penny in federal taxes at the end of the year in terms of the corporate tax rate. So part of this bill is saying these corporations have to pay a minimum of 15% in their taxes, which isn't even getting up to the actual 21% that they should be paying under the current standards of the law, which also isn't even getting back to the previous corporate tax rate under Obama, which was again at 35%. So like the idea that him pushing to tax these corporations at 15%, which is like what, half of what average Americans are paying in their income tax on an annual basis, that is like a completely watered down tax proposal, okay? Keep in mind, if you go look back historically at the United States during the heyday of our, economic expansion in the wake of the New Deal back under FDR, the corporate tax rate was significantly higher than it is right now. And all this is doing is allowing these corporations, instead of paying taxes that could be used to go and fund other programs for the American people, they are using these loopholes, using these bullshit gimmicks that are baked in with the laws by the politicians who were bribed by these corporations who put them there. They're using all of these gimmicks in order to pay absolutely nothing in corporate taxes at the end of the day. So this is one area where Joe Manchin is actually based and correct. But even to that extent, he's also not going far enough because, again, 15% isn't even getting up to what they legally should be paying right now. And still, this reporter has such a problem with that concept that she decides to just completely move on to the next thing without even addressing what he was just saying there.
They're corporations and they know they've got great tax accountants. Heck, they have complete departments trying to come up with ways to find loopholes and to keep and to hire people as well. I mean, let's not forget that too. But 400.
Yeah, let's not forget to thank these corporations for producing jobs, as conservatives like to portray. Not getting into the fact that they underpay their workers, that they union bust like crazy, that they treat them like shit. They are constantly trying to undercut them at every level imaginable. Let's not talk about any of that. Let's just talk about the fact that they are job producers. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and end that clip there because honestly, I can't take any more of that because both of these motherfuckers are wrong. I mean, Joe Manchin made a couple of good points in there, but at the end of the day, both of them are wrong. Both in terms of inflation, both in terms of Build Back Better, in terms of what this bill is actually saying here. So just to give you a little bit more clarification here, we heard from Bernie Sanders recently, who was blasting a lot of the fossil fuel handouts that are within this legislation. So here's what he had to say about it from Common Dreams' Jake Johnson. They say, Senator Bernie Sanders took to the Senate floor on Tuesday to offer a sweeping critique of the Democratic Party's new reconciliation package, applying particularly close scrutiny to the legislation's massive and destructive handouts to the fossil fuel industry. And they say, while Sanders applauded that the act has serious funding for wind, solar, batteries, heat pumps, electric vehicles, energy efficient appliances, and low-income communities that have borne the brunt of climate change, he raised concerns about the billions of dollars in new tax breaks and subsidies that the oil and gas industry will receive under the measure, which could get to a Senate vote as soon as this week. And he said, in my view, if we are going to make our planet healthy and habitable for future generations, we cannot provide billions of dollars in new tax breaks to the very same fossil fuel companies that are currently destroying the planet. And he says, under this legislation, up to 60 million acres of public waters must be offered up for sale each and every year to the oil and gas industry before the federal government could approve any new offshore wind development. So that is kind of what Joe Manchin was hinting at when he was explaining that this is basically offsetting any progress that we are making in renewable investments because they have to be matched beforehand by fossil fuel projects, okay? One of those fossil fuel projects is going straight through West Virginia, Joe Manchin's home state. So just basically pork spending in that circumstance. But He also says that Sanders proceeded to spotlight some of the fossil fuel industry's positive response to the measure, which was negotiated primarily by Joe Manchin, the top recipient of oil and gas campaign donations in Congress. So listen, at the end of the day, I mean, if fossil fuel companies are coming out and praising this piece of legislation, you know that it's not doing enough to confront their power and their destructive influence over the environment right now. I mean, they wouldn't be happy about it if it was actually meaningfully pushing us in the direction of renewable energy and away from fossil fuel usage. The reason why they like this bill is the same reason that Joe Manchin likes this bill, because they're going to profit from this. They are going to profit from the taxes and the subsidies that are within this. They're going to profit from the pipelines that are going to be going through tribal lands and farmers and stuff like that. I just watched an entire video from West Virginia farmers about their land being destroyed by the Mountain Valley pipeline that Joe Manchin wants to get through. So I mean, like, at every single level, this is something that is maybe going to have some positive things in terms of investments in renewable energy, but doesn't even go remotely close to far enough in terms of what the science is saying we need to do to make investments right now to prevent some of the most catastrophic effects from climate change. And that's another important point here, is because we talk about inflation, we talked about deficits and reducing the national debt and whatever the fuck. But listen, there is not any proposed investments in renewable energy. Even the Green New Deal, take the maximum extent that conservatives would say the Green New Deal is going to cost. It is still a tiny fraction of how much it is going to cost in environmental destruction if we do not act on climate change as aggressively and quickly as possible. Okay, so that's something you have to understand at the end of the day. Ignore all of this bullshit talk about deficit reduction and all of that. This entire spending bill, Build Back Better, or even some of the provisions within this one that Manchin is putting forward, it is going to reduce inflation in the sense that it will help average people deal with some of their healthcare costs and otherwise. But also, in terms of investing in renewable energies, you shouldn't even be talking about the debt and the deficit, because there is nothing that is going to cost more than catastrophic consequences from not addressing climate change in a meaningful capacity. And that's not just my opinion. We've seen the data on this. We've seen the studies come out on this. We're talking about upwards of over $100 trillion over the next few decades in global climate destructive costs. Okay, so again, this doesn't even go nearly far enough, has some good things in it, but at the end of the day, if the fossil fuel companies are happy, if Joe Manchin is happy, then it's definitely not going to be doing enough to meaningfully address climate change. But even somebody like Joe Manchin, who has been, again, functionally acting like a Republican throughout the entirety of the Biden administration, even with all of that, still Republicans are turning against him. Still, Republicans are not supporting his inflation bill that he's putting forward right now. Still, you have Fox News ghouls who are pushing him relentlessly on the idea that something could actually be done at all in any capacity whatsoever to address climate change.